Hello everyone, my name is Jack, and today I'm going to be talking about sandboxing in Dungeons & Dragons. Sandboxing in Dungeons & Dragons is when you actually go out and there is no set campaign. You don't have a storyline that you plan on following. You don't have a longer series of events that are going to happen as coordinated by the DM. Instead, you have a bunch of things in the world that the players can just interact with if they choose, and a bunch of things that are in the world that the players may never actually go and see. So the appeal of sandboxing comes from the fact that it is almost the truest form of D&D. It is a form of the game where you can actually do anything. It seems that way, at least to the players. Obviously, behind the screen to the DM, there are some limitations to what they've prepped and how ready they are for what the players are going to do. But it is much freer than the traditional campaign where you're going to do this thing tonight and everyone knows that and you just go and do it. That isn't a problem. That is always a fun way to play Dungeons & Dragons, and I have played that way many times. But I always find that sandboxing is a more freeing version of playing Dungeons & Dragons. What's often so great about sandboxing in Dungeons & Dragons is that it creates this sense of a living world. Because the players feel that they can do anything they want, they feel that the world is truly alive, as compared to a static story in a campaign-driven adventure, where the players feel as if they're characters in a novel going through a set plot. Even though they do know they have some agency in a campaign-style adventure, they can often feel as if they're on railroads. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. People love playing in these styles of campaigns when the DM has crafted this magical story and it feels so real at the time because of the medium in which we're playing. It does feel as if you're like a character in a Lord of the Rings or Hobbit type book. But it always does feel very freeing when you finally do get to have complete and total agency about where your character goes, when he goes there, and how he behaves. And that is what a sandbox gives to players. The true point of a sandbox is the ability to free the player, to make them think that the world is truly alive and that they're just one person in this larger world where they can make a difference if they make the right decisions, or if they want, they can be an insignificant part who just goes and does basic things such as stopping petty thieves or even opening a shop if they want. Me and my friends typically, when we run Dungeons & Dragons, we'll be doing a sandbox campaign. I'd say I've done about 4 or 5 true sandbox campaigns and a couple other that are close to sandbox but had much more story elements. My most recent sandbox campaign is taking place in a pretty traditional European village style setting with all of the normal D&D tropes in the area. I have a goblin cave, I have some cultists, I have a abandoned keep. All these things are in my basic world. So what actually makes a good sandboxing campaign, you may be asking yourself? What makes a good sandboxing campaign, in my opinion, might differ from what you think is a good sandboxing campaign. I am more inclined to like the very traditional baseline fantasy, but the principles that I used to design my sandbox campaign can be used on almost any campaign, just reflavored to whatever style that you plan on running. So what do I like to implement in my sandboxing campaign? Well, I like to steal a lot of the elements from what a West Marches campaign are to bring into my sandboxing campaign. The reason I like to steal a lot from the West Marches is that the West Marches is a type of sandbox campaign, and I think it gives a lot of good baseline rules for what you want to be following when making a sandbox. So what I'd recommend is always having a safe starting town for the players to come back to at the end of any adventure. I'd say that having any adventure inside the starting town isn't necessarily a bad idea, but at the lower levels of play, I'd recommend avoiding it. I would start with a couple of activities, a days or 2 travel away from this starting village. Some basic low-level encounters like maybe a goblin cave or some bandits are always a good start. So when you're actually making a sandbox campaign, I would recommend making a DM map. So the way I would make this DM map is I would get a hex grid paper and I would put the starting village in the center of this hex grid. And then I would label each hex a 6-mile distance. The reason 6 miles is a good distance for each hex is that it allows the party to travel 3 hexes per day on average. That is coming from about how fast an average Dungeons & Dragons character can travel. Obviously, depending on weight or other factors that you may take into account like weather, it may slow them down. But 3 hexes is a good travel distance for 1 day. So then I would recommend starting to seed your map with different types of encounters and dungeons, all varying distances from the starting village. As they get further from the starting village, I would recommend that you make them slightly harder and harder, and that random encounters that happen in these farther regions also correspond with harder play. The reason is, if players can venture out in any direction and the leveling system is random, it's going to feel very weird if you have a first level party who travels 2 days from the town and they're in the max level area and they immediately die, or if you have a max level party who travels months and months from this starting town and then all of a sudden they're in a first level area where they're just killing everything. Obviously, you might want to shake it up a little bit, have some variation with some easier things out further or harder things closer, but I'd recommend sticking to the further you get from this starting town, the harder difficulty the encounters and dungeons become. Now that you've seeded your actual campaign map, you're going to have to inform the players of the different things that they can go and do in this world. One of the simplest ways I'd recommend doing this is a quest board. A quest board can be written on by anyone in the starting town, and they can put out simple clues that lead to the different dungeons, or they can expressly write that there are dungeons out there in specific locations, depending on how easy you want it to be to find the dungeons. Another great way to inform the players of the adventures that they can find out in the wilderness is by having a map that you give to the players. I would recommend that the map you give to the players is not a perfect map. This allows for inaccuracies in travel and allows for spontaneous events to happen while they're traveling, like getting lost, which isn't a thing that happens quite a bit in modern D&D, but it is a very fun thing, let me tell you. During my current campaign, which is a sandbox type campaign, my players have been adventuring out in the wilderness looking for a set of cultists, and during their search for the cultists, there have been many times where they have been informed about around where the cultists should be, but have gotten lost when traveling. And this has allowed us to have many adventures where the entire session would be just trying to get back onto the path that the players are trying to follow, because they're traveling through the wilderness without any real direction, like they don't have a physical path or stream to be following. It also rewards players for following things such as streams and roads, which would often have actual structures on them, which would lead them to dungeons. In my campaign, I actually stole the idea of the map being on a wooden table in the center of the tavern, and I would recommend you steal that as well. But if you have a better idea for how the map gets to the players, such as a letter from a higher power or a message from the divine, then so be it. Have fun, it's your campaign. Obviously, in a sandbox campaign, you're going to want to have player agency, because that is what makes it a sandbox campaign. And the best way to have player agency is to remind the players that they are free to go and explore the map however they want. Exploration should be a key part of a sandbox campaign. Not only should they be going from starting town to dungeon, they should also be exploring the wilderness, looking for dungeons that they don't know exist, or looking for people that they don't know exist. It's always fun when you're running through the woods, not sure where you're going, and you stumble upon a huge wizard's tower that has been lost to time. Another thing that makes the wilderness inside a sandbox campaign so fun is random encounters. I would recommend creating regions around your starting town, each with different random encounter tables, with different chances to encounter things such as animals, but also some more exciting things such as people, travelers, or even bad guys who could be out on the woods. While sandboxing is about exploring the wilderness, you do want to have a fun and exciting starting town, because lots of time can be spent in a session just shopping around or talking to local NPCs about where to go and explore. So coming up with fun and memorable NPCs is an important part of starting a sandbox campaign. But you should remember that when you are coming up with these NPCs, that if they are too outlandish, your players will actually lose interest in them. I've often found that if a NPC is so outlandish that the players find it difficult to even imagine them as a person that exists, that they will lose interest in them. Sometimes, obviously, they actually gravitate towards these kind of people, but that is a rare case where the person is extravagant in a fun and exciting way. So I would limit how extravagant each of these NPCs are. Obviously, give them their own personalities, desires, and goals, but don't go overboard with flamboyant personalities too often. Because if you have a town full of Broadway personalities, often it will make the players lose interest in the entire town. The main thing to remember when creating a sandbox campaign is that you're trying to give the players as much agency as possible. You want to seed the world with as many different things to do, but you don't want to have to overwhelm yourself as the DM. So, while you may put a lot of things on the map, do not go about creating them until the players actually say that they have a plan of going there or before they get too close. You are the DM, so you control how the flow of time works inside your world. So if you need to slow the players down so that they don't end up getting to a specific region too fast, you can slow them down yourself by creating things such as random encounters or distractions. Distracting players is actually quite easy. You can just throw a NPC that asks for help or a group of bandits that steals an item from the party and then runs off. All of those work perfectly as good distractions to buy you some time before the players actually get to the main dungeon they're looking to get to. And in that time that you create, don't slack. Create the dungeon in a time-efficient manner. So I'd recommend going on a website such as Dungeon Scroll and building out the dungeon that way. I've always found that building dungeons in Dungeon Scroll is quite easy. This isn't a sponsored segment or anything. I just personally have used that platform and think it is a good platform for creating simple but effective dungeons. If you have a different platform you like using, by all means, use it. But you must remember that when creating a sandbox type game, you don't want to keep the players from their goals for too long though, as player agency is the main goal of the sandbox. By delaying the players too long, you are stripping them from some form of agency, even if they don't necessarily know it. I wouldn't recommend doing that for too long because eventually they might catch on and feel as if their options in the sandbox are being railroaded or limited by you. In a lot of my sandbox type campaigns, my friends often open shops, and you would think like, why are they opening a shop when they could be out adventuring and killing monsters and having fun? And the reason that they like to open shops is because it provides a stable source of income. So I would say that you'd actually want to avoid doing that because often when they open the shop, they like to get sedentary and they don't like to go adventure. So if your friends are looking for a way to make passive income in Dungeons and Dragons, I would recommend trying to find some way to not necessarily thwart it, but more incentivize the actual adventuring type of play. Like maybe make magical items extremely hard to get unless they actually go out and adventure in these tombs and crypts and such. Maybe if they really want, they can open up a shop or they can become merchants. But if they do decide to go down that path, then you're going to have to look for a way to actually spice that up, because a daily life of a merchant in a medieval European type setting is going to be extremely dull and boring, and people are quickly going to not want to play it, and often they will just go back to adventuring. They will decide that the game is boring. So what you're going to want to do if your friends are really set in like this merchant or store type mindset is you're going to want to do something such as have like bandits constantly try to rob the store, or maybe have them possess a magical item that this wizard wants to get. But since they're a respected merchant, the wizard is just going to keep trying to buy it, or maybe send goons to try to steal it. It just depends on how you want to go about spicing it up, but don't let the campaign become boring just because your friends have become sedentary and you are unable to come up with a creative way to spice up adventuring in dungeons. If you can't spice up the adventuring, then you just have to spice up the sedentary lifestyle. That got us a little off track, but let's get back to what's important when you're sandboxing in Dungeons and Dragons. When working within a sandbox type campaign, you might have issues deciding when players are to level up and such, especially because milestone leveling has become such a prevalent force in modern D&D. So I'd recommend actually rereading the rules from different systems on how to actually do treasure-based leveling. I often like to do the classic 1 gold equals 1 experience point. This promotes going out and adventuring and exploring, as well as makes deciding when the players level much easier than having to pick some sort of arbitrary milestone, such as every couple sessions or every couple dungeon levels. The gold gives a set in stone way for players to gain levels. And based on this, you're going to want to fill your dungeons with a corresponding amount of loot to their level. So you're going to want to be putting a lot of gold within the dungeons, depending on how hard the dungeon is to complete and like the monsters within it. Now, this creates a whole new aspect of the game that is not often talked about in modern D&D, which is transporting your gold to and from the dungeon. I, in my most recent sandbox campaign, had it so that there was 80,000 copper pieces in a goblin cave. My friends knew that that was worth taking, but were unsure about how to actually take it back to the town. The cave wasn't directly on the road, so it was hard to get mules or pack animals up to the cave, even though they had already cleared it out. But they had to think of creative ways to slowly transport the copper out of the cave to the road to mules to get moved to the town. And that created a whole session worth of content where I didn't actually have to prep anything for this huge sandbox. I just had to talk about how they were moving gold. And though that may seem boring, you can make this fun by having different challenges pop up while they're trying to move the gold, or have different people that they need to talk to convince to help them move the gold. Even though sandboxing is the same base game as the linear storytelling version of D&D, it opens up a whole new possibility of what characters can do and what characters even want to be doing. Creating a sandbox type campaign can be a great way to avoid having to front load way too much content or get overwhelmed by complex plots and interwoven character narratives. I've always found that sandbox campaigns are one of my favorite types of campaigns. If you ever get out there and get to try a sandbox campaign, leave it down in the comments below and tell us how that worked out for you. That's all I have for today, folks. So if you enjoyed the video, just leave a like down below. Thanks for watching. I hope you have a great day, week, month, and year. Thanks for stopping by.